If you don't know your instructions right, if you don't know what you're supposed to be knowing, you can get in a lot of trouble. So as Christians, we need to be sure we remember what it is that God has called us to do. It is to live righteous, holy, and pure lives, as this text is going to tell us. But if you try to do that in your own strength, as we've talked about throughout this text in Ephesians, you'll fail miserably every time. So today we're going to talk a little bit about how to get rid of that old nature, that sinful nature. And then in the next lesson or two, we'll be talking about how to replace it with the spiritual nature and how to let the Holy Spirit produce His natural fruit within us. We left off last week in verse 16 of Ephesians chapter 4, so we'll pick up in verse 17. With the Lord's authority, I say this: live no longer as the Gentiles do, for they are hopelessly confused. Their minds are full of darkness. They wander far from the life God gives because they have closed their minds and hardened their hearts against Him. They have no sense of shame. They live for lustful pleasure and eagerly practice every kind of impurity. But that isn't what you learned about Christ. Since you have heard about Jesus and have learned the truth that comes from Him, throw off your old sinful nature and your former way of life, which is corrupted by lust and deception. Instead, let the Spirit renew your thoughts and attitudes. Put on your new nature, created to be like God, truly righteous and holy. Now, I've had this discussion with you many times before, but it fits here because I want to go back and read that last verse in the New American Standard Bible, which I believe is probably the most accurate to the original text that we have. Probably the most accurate. The New Living and the New International Version and many others are what we call dynamic equivalencies. They're accurate as well for the most part, but they're subject to a little more interpretation because multitudes of people worked on them through the years. The NASB is probably the most accurate to the original language that we have, way more so than even the King James. And this verse in verse 17 says, in the new ASB, so I say this and affirm together with the Lord that you walk no longer just as the Gentiles also walk in the futility of their mind. And the Greek word there literally means walk more than it means live, which is used more in the dynamic equivalency versions. Now, it may surprise you, but you can tell a lot about a person by the way they walk. You really can. Sarah Snodgrass did a whole lot of research into this when she was at Skidmore College, and she's now one of the deans at Florida Atlantic University here in the state, and she did a lot of scholarly research to decipher the language of walking, linking motor skills to personality traits. And the research is fascinating, and she uses multitudes of examples of people that we would know, and you look at it in her research and the examples she gives, and you say, oh, there might be something to that. For instance, she found that people who waddle usually are impulsive and very independent. People who drag their feet tend to be sad and frustrated and more often depressed than others. A stride is often indicative of a person who's bold and confident. And you see a whole lot of athletes and you see a whole lot of politicians who stride. A person on tiptoes is often bashful. And a person who shuffles can be unorganized and lazy. So whatever you do, don't shuffle out of here tonight. Everybody's going to be watching. Now, obviously, it's not an exact science. You have to take into account a lot of things. You have to take into account corns and blisters and ingrown toenails. Right now, I have an ingrown toenail that might cause me to waddle or shuffle out of here tonight. You have to take into account pregnancy, right, women? I mean, definitely have to take that into account. You even have to take into account hemorrhoids. They affect how you walk. Should I stop? But generally speaking, your gait is a gateway to your character. And that is definitely true, spiritually speaking. The scriptures say this kind of thing over and over again. Of course, when Paul speaks of a person's walk, he's not talking about their motor skills. He is talking about their lifestyle, as verse 17 said in the NLT. It's not how they move their feet. It's how they move through life. It's about how they see themselves, how they see God, how they treat others, and how they navigate life. But most importantly, it is about how they relate to God. And the first thing Paul said was, we should no longer walk as the rest of the Gentiles. In the Old Testament, from God's vantage point, there were only two kinds of people. There were Jews and everybody else. Literally everybody else was Gentiles. So with the coming of Christ, there came a whole new third race. Christians, who in effect were neither Jew or Gentile. The suffix "in" means bearing the characteristic of Christ, and who only wanted to live as Christ lived. So just like their friends and relatives, the Ephesian believers were for the most part Gentiles, not nearly as many Jews living there, but they were of a different breed than the Gentiles that they knew. These are second generation Christians most likely, although some of them were still first generation Christians. So they had almost certainly been raised as Gentiles and pagans. And now they were a whole new race of people. Spiritually, they had been born again. They now have a new nature, a new love, a new hope, a new power, new ties with a whole new community. And that made them different, just like a purebred dog is different. What if you spent big bucks, I mean really big bucks, to purchase a certified purebred dog with an impeccable pedigree? I never had one of those. But he had papers and he had a bloodline and he was registered with the Canine Society and all those kind of things. Would you let that dog out and just run wherever he wanted to run? Run with the pack? Run with the feral dogs? Hang out with the mongrel dogs? Of course not. You don't treat a registered dog like you treat the rest of the dogs. And that is how Paul sees us as Christians. We are purebred. We have a new nature, a new love, a new loyalty. We are part of an exclusive bloodline. The bloodline of Jesus Christ, who paid for our salvation with His blood. And we are registered as newborn again believers, a third race, in heaven's Lamb's book of life. That's why we're to be different. That's why he says in verses 17 through 22, don't live like the regular Gentiles are living. Live differently. And that's why the excuse that people often make today, well, everybody is doing it, everybody else is doing it, is so lame. We are not like everybody else. As Christians, we are of a different stock. We were bought with the high price of Jesus' blood. Imagine your purebred pup asking, well, why can't I go play in the garbage like the junkyard dogs? Other dogs get fleas. Why can't I? And that's how Christians are acting when they refuse to live a holy, separated, different life. And when they instead blend in with the crowd and say, well, everybody in the culture is doing it, they're not being any different from the Gentiles. They're not being any different, even though they should be in Christ. And they don't realize how special they've become. So he gives us some walking styles, you might say, to avoid. And he begins in verse 17 by saying, don't walk like the Gentiles do in the futility of their mind. The phrase is literally translated empty-headed. There is no overarching direction in their life. Have you ever known somebody like this? They live like they're on a wild goose chase and there isn't a goose. That's the way some people live. They really do. They're always searching, but they're never finding. I love the way C.S. Lewis once described the Christless world as being always winter, but never Christmas. That's the way life is without the Christ. There's nothing meaningful to break up the bleak. He said the Gentiles in verses 17 and 18 walk in the futility of their mind, having their understanding darkened, excluded from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them. Having their understanding darkened. Can you imagine what it would be like to live totally in a darkened world? I've thought a lot about which sense. You know, you see these kinds of questions sometimes. Which sense would you hate to give up the most? Which sense would you hate to lose the most? And I think for me it's sight. I do think for me it's sight. I think I could give up smell. I think I did in COVID. I think I could give up taste. I did there in COVID too. I think I could give up touch. I really do. I think if I had to, I could give up hearing. My oldest son, Scott, had a brain tumor and has lost all hearing in one ear. He functions fine. But give up sight. It's dark all the time. That'd be awfully hard to do. Imagine, do you know one of the first reasons why with hostages, kidnappers put blindfolds on them? Because it's very intimidating, disorienting to not know where you are or to be able to see anything around you, having your vision obscured. And that's what people without Christ live like all the time. Turn your back on God, and morally and spiritually, your visibility is zero. Your heart is blind. Like a pilot who loses his instruments while flying in a fog or in a terrible storm. And so many pilots have crashed for that very reason. Trying to fly by instrument because that's all they can see. They can't see anything else. So he has no bearing. No communication with the tower. He's disoriented and destined to crash. That's the way life without God is. They're darkened in their understanding. For a person without God, you could say that life is like a jigsaw puzzle with no box top. Try to do that sometime. You have no idea what the completed puzzle should look like because life doesn't really make any sense to you. Now, how can we reject our sinful nature? Well, he said in verse 22, refuse to follow the sinful nature's desires. What does that mean? Sometimes it means you need to get rid of your old vocabulary. You need to get rid of the places you used to go before you became a Christian. Maybe you need to get rid of some old friends and not follow them back. I think you were there. I know there was 3 of us there at about 4 or 5 years after we had graduated from high school at Lipscomb. I was with, I think it was you and Bill, at Sir Pete's on Nolensville Road in Nashville, and there was a guy sitting across the room from us who was one of our high school, and he was one of the roughest guys in high school. And we had known back then, you were there. We had known back then that he had done drugs. His name was Mark. I won't call his last name in case he's watching. And but we had known back then that he had done drugs, even in high school. And this is 4 or 5 years later. And as he gets up to leave the Sir Pete's, he sees us across the room, and he comes across to our table and says, "Hey, man, just want to give y'all a tip. The narcs are out heavy. The narcs are watching all around us." And I said, "Well, thanks, Mark. But you know, I'm a preacher now down in Chapel Hill. I mean, sometimes you just got to get rid of the old friend." He wasn't really a big friend in high school, but he was an acquaintance. But my point being, sometimes you got to get away from the people who might influence you to do wrong. It's a great old story about an eagle flying over Niagara Falls. It was the coldest day of winter, and the river was rushing to the falls. It was full of large blocks of ice, and the eagle spotted a rodent trapped on one of those blocks of ice, unable to escape. So he circled around and swooped down on the rodent and had himself a live, fresh meal of ice. And the eagle's enjoying his meal, and the people watching from the shore realize that they're coming up close to the falls. And they're yelling and trying to get the eagle's attention because they don't want to see that beautiful, majestic eagle go over the falls and be killed. And it was as if the eagle, when he would look up from his meal, was actually looking at the falls. And you could see the self-confidence in him as he was saying, "I have plenty of time. I'm in control. I can take care of myself. I can fly off anytime I want just before we get to the falls." And the spectators said, just as the block of ice was getting ready to go over the precipice, the eagle spread his wings in that impressive formation and tried to fly, and he couldn't. He discovered that his claw, too, had become encased in the ice. He was dragged over the falls to his death. I've seen Christians that way. It's actually a pretty powerful warning to each of us about what sin will do to us, slowly and surely, and sometimes we don't realize it. I'm talking to Christians who say, "Well, I can quit anytime I want to." Are you so sure? I've talked to many Christians who say, "Well, I have it under control." Oh, really? Are you positively convinced you do? Sometimes a Christian will say something like, "I can take it or leave it." Isn't that a brilliant statement? Are there any other options? Of course you can take it or you can leave it. It's not like there's a third option. One guy told me one time, "I can quit smoking anytime I want to." I know because I've quit smoking 79 times. You can come to a place in your life where a sin or even a habit controls you rather than you controlling it. And if you don't learn how to deal with that old man of sin, that old nature of sin within you, it will. And one of the ways you deal with that is by refusing to feed its desires. Those two natures are struggling within you all the time. Galatians 5 says it perfectly. The sinful nature wants to do evil, and he's writing this to Christians. He's not writing this to non-Christians. He's writing this to the church at Galatia. So he's writing to believers. The sinful nature wants to do evil, which is just the opposite of what the Spirit wants. And the Spirit gives us desires that are the exact opposite of what the sinful nature desires. And these two forces are constantly fighting each other. so that you are not free to carry out your good intentions. All of us are continually in a spiritual fight with the sinful nature, which will not be cured finally until at last in heaven, against the spiritual nature. The spiritual nature in most of us, thankfully, continues to win out. Paul talked about his own battle with this in Romans chapter 7 in an incredibly autobiographical account of how he did what he didn't want to do and he didn't do what he wanted to do. Another way of saying this. It's a constant battle that our spiritual nature is in with our sinful nature. Some people struggle with pornography and lust and impure sexual thoughts. And if that's the case, you have to just not feed it. Some people struggle with drugs, even sometimes prescription drugs. And if that's the case, you have to learn how to not feed it. Some people have a particular weakness for alcohol, and they become alcoholics, which is the greatest drug in America. And if that is your particular weakness, you have to learn to not feed it. Stay away from it. Avoid it at all costs. Our text says, leave those desires, those lusts, turn and walk away from it. Because if you feed them, they will get stronger. But if you starve them, the more and more that you starve them and feed Jesus' nature, it gets stronger. Refuse to follow it and hang out with it and refuse to feed it. You need to recognize that old man because he is still there. Refusing him and not feeding him leads you toward the spiritual nature. But then you have to replace it with something else. You absolutely have to replace it with something else. Kind of like the guy who wrote the letter to the IRS one time, and he said, "Gentlemen, enclosed you will find a check for $150. I cheated on my income tax return last year, and I have not been able to sleep ever since. And if I still have trouble sleeping, I'll send you the rest of it." That's what you call halfway repentance. He stopped doing what was wrong, but he didn't start doing what was right. You need to not only recognize the old man and refuse that sinful nature, but you need to replace it with the spiritual. Maybe do you remember Jesus told a story about that, about the woman who swept out her house and swept out the demons, but because she didn't replace it with something positive and spiritual, 7 times as many demons came back. Wow. You have to replace it with something. So, what do you replace it with? You throw off your old sinful nature, our text says, and your former way of life, which is corrupted by lust and deception, and instead, you let the Spirit renew your thoughts and attitudes, and you put on your new nature created to be like God, truly righteous and holy. So I want you to think about this in terms of clothing, because in the letter to the church at Colossae, in Colossians, he talks about taking off your old sinful clothing and putting on your new spiritual clothing. And so it would have been very common for people in the first century church, whether it's Ephesus, Colossae, or Galatia, it would be very common for them to be thinking about putting on and taking off clothing in the context of these verses and these passages. So think of it that term. Take off your old clothing or your dirty clothing and put on new, clean clothing. None of you in this room have on right now the same thing you wore all day yesterday and last night. I hope. But that's an act of your will. You looked in the mirror. It's funny. We had our grandchildren overnight, 3 of them overnight, 3 youngest ones, and the Calvin still had on at 5 o'clock this afternoon his pajamas from yesterday. So I told Diane I was going to make this illustration. I said we could say this about everybody but Calvin because he's his own type. But anyway, for all the rest of us, we have put on our different clothing. And you put on something you thought was appropriate for church. And notice it wasn't how you felt. You say, I don't feel like putting on new clothes. It's a thing you do by an act of your will. It's what you do in your walk with Jesus. You put on joyous clothes instead of mourning clothes. The prophet said it this way: He will give a crown of beauty for ashes, a joyous blessing of mourning, festive praise instead of despair. And in their righteous clothing, they will be like great oaks that the Lord has planted for His own glory. You praise even when you don't feel like it, and guess what? You will start to feel like it. You start praising when you feel discouraged or depressed or despair, and you watch how the spirit of despair leaves. It's an act of your will. Those of you who've been around for very many of the 41 years that I have preached here have heard me say this over and over and over again. It's one of the top 3 or 4 things I ever say. You know what they are. The 9 most important words in the world is I was wrong, I'm sorry, please forgive me, I love you. It's actually 12 words, isn't it? 12 most important words in the world. You know, the ultimate statistic is 1 out of 1 die. That's 2 that I say 1,000,000 times, and this is the 3rd thing I say 1,000,000 times. You act your way into feeling. You don't feel your way into acting. That's exactly what this passage is telling us. You act according to the Spirit living in you and according to you being a Christian in Christ. You act that way, and then the feelings follow of it. You act what Isaiah the prophet just said, and then the feelings follow it. If you wait for the feeling to come first, you'll never act. That's the flesh. Feelings are a part of the flesh, the spiritual nature. Acting is a part of the Spirit. That takes a new attitude in the mind. That's what verse 23 in our text says. Be new in the attitude of your minds. That's why Proverbs 23:7 says, the man thinketh in his heart, so is he. I heard about a Sunday school teacher one time who was talking along these same lines to his high school boys class. He said, guys, I just want you to know that whatever you think about the most, that is what you'll become. And one boy said, uh-oh, I'm going to become a 17-year-old girl for sure. But whatever you think about the most is generally what you do. A thought becomes a deed becomes a habit becomes a lifestyle, and a lifestyle becomes a destiny. We've all heard that. But it starts with a thought. If your thinking is wrong, ultimately in the end result, your destiny will be wrong. But if you can address it right here in your thinking mind, if you start thinking right in your walk with Jesus, that's when your actions and your walk or your lifestyle will be affected in a spiritual manner as well. The brain is an amazing organ. It is very hard to maintain 2 discordant thoughts at the same time. With most of us, it's impossible, actually. It's not just hard. 2 discordant thoughts at the same time. That's why if you feel the spiritual side in your brain, it's hard for you simultaneously to experience the sinful or the fleshly side. Your brain starts working the moment you are born, and it doesn't stop until you stand up in front of a crowd to speak. But your brain can only think of one thing at a time. You say, well, mine can't even think of one thing sometimes. Okay, we'll make an exception for you. You remember when Jesus raised Lazarus from the grave, and the man had been dead for 4 days? He was so dead that his sister, Mary, said, by this time he stinketh. That was in the King James Version, and that's one of the times I love to use the King James Version. By this time, Lord, he stinketh. Yet when Jesus called Lazarus front and center, the corpse obeyed, and he bounced out of the mouth of the grave, still encased in his shroud, but he had totally new life. He was still wearing grave clothes, but he had totally new life. That is our portrait. We are still in our flesh that we were saved in. He has raised us to a new life, but we're still wearing some of the old identity, and we still have some of the old attitudes, he says in this text, that we need to put off and put on the new. See yourself as Christ sees you, and swap your grave clothes for grace clothes. Would be a good way to say it, really. And it would be true. I love the story of Augustine, true story. At one time he was far from a Christian before he became what we know as Saint Augustine. He lived with a woman and bore a son out of wedlock. And one day after his conversion to Christianity, his former mistress saw him on the street and sprinted his way, saying, "Augustine, it is I, it is I." And he took off in the opposite direction, shouting, "Yes, but it is not I. It is not I." He wasn't the same person. He had put on the new man and taken off the old man. He was now living a new identity and a new purpose. Each time we think or act, it carves a rut into our personality so that it becomes easier to think or act that way again. We didn't know this at the time the Bible was written. But we know this now. We know this. One of the most fascinating things I ever read was the first 2 chapters of Jordan Peterson's book, 12 Rules for Life, in which he describes, as a neuropsychologist and psychiatrist, what others have described as well, the incredible neural pathways of our mind and their ability to change every single part of the way we act, because what we think about constantly creates ruts. I'd be willing to bet, if I were a betting man, that when you go to bed at night, you think about the same thing almost every night. When you are in certain routines of your life, you follow pretty much the same routine in your thinking all the time. That's because our minds were created that way. And over time, the rut gets larger and larger until it takes over. Rather than being shaped by your thoughts, it's now a channel for those thoughts. And one day you wake up and find out that the rut is now the rudder. It is guiding and directing you, unless you specifically make a mental decision to change it, or as we've heard so many times, we first make our habits, then our habits make us. The job of putting off and putting on is ditching old habits and old patterns of thought and old attitudes of the mind and developing new ones. And when we allow the Spirit to do that, it justifies and strengthens the identity inside of us as one who belongs to Christ.